And for our final chapter, chapter 13 is called Judgment, Decisions, and Reasoning. So, a decision is going to be how we process or make a choice between two alternatives. Like sometimes we have to make decisions about, maybe what we'll have for breakfast. Do I want pancakes or do I want cereal? Reasoning is the process of drawing conclusions. So, when you're faced with a situation and you have to think deeply about it, you have to reason and come up with alternative um, conclusions that could be at play. Inductive reasoning is reasoning that's based on observation and being able to reach a conclusion from evidence. It's sort of like the strength of an argument. It could be based on representativeness of observations. It can be based on the number of observations that have taken place. It can be based on the quality of observations. So we are able to reason using inductive reasoning when we're able to look at things and come up with a claim. Inductive reasoning is also used to make scientific discoveries, forming a hypothesis and coming up with a certain solution. It can be used in everyday life to predict what will happen based on what we've seen or even based on what's happened in the past. Heuristics is another way we think, really based on rules of thumbs, things that are likely to provide the correct answer to a problem. But I always tell students to think of heuristics as mental shortcuts. They are things that will lead to a solution, but a lot of the time, the solution it leads to is incorrect. And then two of the most commonly used heuristics we have are the availability heuristics and the representativeness heuristic. And we're going to talk about what those mean. The availability heuristic says that events are more likely to be remembered based on things that are available or easily remembered in our mind. And in your book, you've got an example of, different causes of death of somebody. What I always like to think of with the availability heuristic is I like to think of gambling. And people who tend to engage in gambling are always looking for their next win. They don't think about all the times they lose. They just think about if I could just hit 5,000 or $10,000 again. They remember the bells, they remember the whistle, they remember the good feeling, they remember the congratulations, and they look for that again. So they believe that they will be successful again at gambling because all that's available to them, all they remember in their mind, are the times they've won, not the times they've lost. Illusory correlations can also be a part of heuristics. That's the correlation that appears to exist, um, that says that something appears to exist but either does not exist or is much weaker than assumed. So, for example, stereotypes can relate to this. And a stereotype is an oversimplification, an overgeneralization about a group or a class of people that focuses on something negative. So whenever we believe that something is related to something else, sometimes we can be wrong. The representativeness heuristic says that the probability of A being a member of class B is determined by how well the properties of A resemble what's normally associated with B. So we use the base rate of information if it's always available, and we use descriptive information if available and disregard the base rate information. Another way I like to describe representativeness heuristic is like to talk about, um, you know, for us, we tend to have all of these generalizations or stereotypes we make about ourselves in our mind. For example, if somebody who's 7 feet tall walked into the room, a common question they might be asked is, do you play basketball? Because in our mind, we think that someone who's 7 feet tall must play basketball. When in reality, not everybody who's really tall plays basketball. But if we think a basketball player represents somebody who is tall, then we might make that incorrect assumption. With heuristics, there's also a term called the conjunction rule, which says that the probability of conjunction um, with two events cannot be higher than the probability of the single constituents of that event. For example, in your book, it talks about, a feminist bank teller being a subset of the bank tellers, and it's always more likely that someone in the bank teller, that someone in a bank is feminist, but it doesn't mean that's always the case. Also, with heuristics, we can have the law of large numbers, which says that the larger the number of individuals randomly drawn from the population, the more representative the resulting group will be of the entire population. So if we've got a large group, then of course that's going to increase the odds of us being right about something. The my-side bias is a tendency for people to generate and evaluate evidence and test their hypotheses in a way that is based toward their own opinions and attitudes. So whatever is fitting to them. And then we have the confirmation bias, which is our tendency to selectively look for information that conforms to our hypothesis. And then we overlook information that goes against it. So we look for things that confirm what we already think. And if something contradicts that, we just ignore it. So there was a study over the my-side bias, which was by Lord and co-workers in 1979, that had those in favor of capital punishment and those against capital punishment in the same article. And then those in favor found the article convincing, and those against it found the article unconvincing, because they're already trying to just keep people on their side. Another good way to think about the my-side bias is, with politics. Deductive reasoning occurs when we determine whether a conclusion logically follows from a premises. So we also look at the relationship between two categories using words like all, no, or some. So it says that syllogism is valid if a conclusion follows logically from its two premises. And if two premises of a valid syllogism are true, the syllogism's conclusion must also be true. So it does not confuse validity and truth when it comes to syllogism. So when we think about it, how well can people actually judge what's valid? We can always have many errors. There's something called the belief bias, which is our tendency to think that a syllogism is valid if its conclusions are believable. We also have the mental mode approach, which is a specific situation that's represented in a person's mind that can be used to help determine the validity of a syllogism in deductive reasoning. It can help you create a model of a situation, generate tentative conclusions about the model, look for exceptions to falsify the model, and to determine the validity of the syllogism. The Watson four-card problem is a good example of a conditional reasoning problem. This is where a person has to determine the minimum number of cards to turn over. If there's a vowel on one side and then there's also an even number on the other side, which one would you need to turn over to determine whether or not this is true? And you can find the answer in your textbook. Permission schema says that if A is satisfied, then B can be carried out. And this can be used in the concrete versions and also when people are familiar with the rules. The falsification principle is to test the rule. It says to test the rule, you must look for situations that falsify the rule. So you've got to look for what doesn't make it true. And most participants often fail to falsify the principle. And when the problem is stated in concrete everyday terms, the correct responses can be greatly increased. So in 1992, there was a study to test out if this Watson test really exists in real life. So researchers created an unfamiliar situation where treating could occur. Most participants in the study did very well. People It was found that people may be more sensitive to situations involving permissions or regulations. And from an evolutionary perspective, being on the lookout for cheaters is important to survival. When it comes to the conditional reasoning, context is important. Familiarity is not always as important as context. When we make decisions, we use the expected utility theory, which says that people are rational. If they have all relevant information, they will make a decision that results in the maximum expected utility. Utility refers to the outcomes that are desirable because they are in the person's best interest. That is the maximum monetary payoff. When it comes to our ability to make decisions, sometimes our emotions can affect our decision making. We all have expected emotions and sometimes emotions that people predict they will feel when they receive a certain outcome. And we know that people can inaccurately predict their own emotions because we don't really know how we'll feel until we're in a situation. There are some advantages for the utility approach, which is the specific procedures to determine the best choice. And then there's also some problems for the utility approach, which says that um, it's not necessarily money that people find valuable. Sometimes people find value in other things, and many decisions are not maximized by the probability of the best outcome. We also have to consider incidental emotions. These are emotions that are not specifically related to the decision making process. They could be related to a person's personality or their general disposition, um, recent experiences, or their environment or surroundings. And then incidental emotions can also be affected by one's overall decision making process. So when we make decisions, it depends on how choices are presented. We can use the opt-in procedure, which is where we, step up to do something like I want to do this, such as be an organ donor, or we can use the opt-out procedure, which says, I don't want to be an organ donor unless I've requested it. And then we also have the status quo bias, which says that there's a tendency to do nothing when faced with making a decision. Like we're okay with the status quo and things being the way they are. Sometimes the decisions we have to make are risky. Risk aversion strategy is used when problems are stated in terms of gains, and risk taking strategies occur when a problem is stated in terms of losses. The framing effect says that our decisions are influenced by how a decision is stated. It can highlight one aspect of a situation, and it can determine, how people make their decision. For example, when you go to the grocery store, do you choose the beef that is 30% lean or 80% lean, right? So those packages and the way things are stated to you are going to influence your decisions. The physiology of thinking says that sometimes we do things like the ultimatum game, where we are often rejected with low offers because we often reject those low offers because they become angry that offers were unfair. And then also neuroeconomics, which says that decisions are influenced by emotions, and those emotions are associated with the activity in specific areas of the brain. We also have Sanfei and coworkers who did a study in 2003, which says that more activation of the right anterior insula, which is connected to our emotional states, caused participants to be more likely to reject more offers. So we know that emotions is important in decision making, and that's why people are often persuaded using emotional appeals. There's also the dual systems approach to thinking, which says that When people think, it can be fast, automatic, intuitive, and non-conscious. That's system 1, or it can also be slow, deliberate, conscious, and control. Much of our day-to-day existence is handled by system 1 thinking. So we get up, we automatically brush our teeth, we go through our daily routines, get in the car, drive, which is daily routine. Those are mostly system 1 actions. And then system 2 takes over when we need to be more thoughtful, when we're doing something that takes a lot that's not really routine to us. Favor terms, type 1 processing and type 2 processing, and similar characteristics are going to be a concept more of system 1 and system 2. And this can be favored by many researchers because it reflects the interconnected distributed processing that often occurs in the brain. Hopefully, this information has been helpful for you understanding Chapter 13.